University of Singapore. She works in cognitive psychology. And in today's presentation, she's going to be elaborating on the phonological mental lexicon and those associations and measures that she has been analyzing, specifically when it comes to the different networks. So we're very interested because our project is similar, has similar interests. So we're looking forward to this presentation and to learning more from Cynthia. So thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours, Cynthia.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to share my work in this platform. I have attended a few of the talks and listened to some of the recordings, and I've learned a lot. So it is a great honor to be here contributing uh, a talk myself. So without further ado, I will get started. Let me just minimize the Zoom. Okay. Um, so today's talk will consist of four parts. Um, I want to talk a little bit about how we can represent the phonological lexicon as a network and talk about the different measures that we can get out of a network representation. And then the second and third parts, I will go through these two parts a bit more quickly because this is a bit more of a work from my PhD time. It's quite dated, but just to highlight how we can look at how the structure affects processing and how we can study how the network structure changes over time. Um, and in the last part, I will discuss some of my more recent work where I, I'm trying to get the two circles in the Venn diagram to come a bit closer together. So specifically, as the lexicon grows over time or as it changes in size, how might that mediate the processes that occur within it? And sort of look at that from the perspective of an individual sensitivity to larger scale network structure. So my research interest is in words. I've always found words very interesting because they are very complex entities, and they have interesting properties, interesting personalities, if you will. And they also have very interesting relationships and friends with other words in the lexicon. So we know a lot about words from many years of psycholinguistic research. So for example, we can count how frequently a word occurs in written corpora. We can ask human raters, and now we can ask large language models to give us to rate the words on properties like valence and arousal. But words are also interesting because they share various kinds of relationships with other words. And so words can be friends or be neighbors based on phonological similarity, so based on how similar they sound. They can also be similar in terms of its spelling or orthography. Um, and words also share a lot of semantic, meaning-based relationships with other words. We can quantify them in various ways. And so on this slide, I want to talk a little bit about why we want to make this big map of the relationships across thousands and thousands of words. Um, so if we start with a simple example of the English word speech, um, and we can try and look into a dictionary and see which words sound similar to the word speech. And these are the three phonological neighbors of the word speech, right? So we have a small map here. Um, but this map is not complete because the three phonological neighbors of the word speech, which is speak, speed, and peach, they themselves have their own phonological neighbors. And so we need to include them into the graph, right? We do that, immediately it becomes a lot more complicated. Um, but it's still not complete because actually the yellow nodes here, which are like for example, beach and reach, we didn't yet include their phonological neighbors. So we need to do that, and once we do that, we get a very big, complicated looking structure. And this is a representation of the phonological similarity relationships across thousands of words. Uh, so we need some methods to give us a way of make sense of this data. So here, just a very brief introduction to network science, which is I guess the framework, the tool that I'm using to study the relationships of words. It is an interdisciplinary field where they are interested in studying complex networks, and they use methodology and ideas and theories from a whole range of various scientific fields like mathematics, sociology, physics, and many others. So networks are they might seem complicated, but you can reduce them to a set of nodes and a set of edges. Um, the nodes are the circles in all of the network diagrams that you'll see. And so these are the units, the entities that we are trying to model in the system. Um, and the edges, they're also known as, you can call them, I might say, links or connections or edges, but they depict a meaningful relationship between pairs of nodes. Um, so what I have on this figure here is not a language network, actually. It's a social network of characters from the Lord of the Rings movie. And it's to showcase to you that network science is a very flexible, general purpose framework that enables us to study the relationships between entities. So here we have the characters are the nodes, and if two characters are found in the same scene in the movie, we draw a connection between them. So we have a very simple rule, and then we have a very interesting social system that we can then analyze further. So when we have the networks, a nice thing that we can leverage on is all of the methods and the measures from network science to study the system at different levels. Um, so at well, the simplest is to focus at the individual nodes in the system. And so we call these measures a micro level measure. So let's say we're interested in the red node here. How can we quantify things around it, right? Um, we can also zoom all the way out and look at the entire network, and we have measures that give us some information about the structure of the entire network. These are known as macro level measures. We can also go in the in-between level and look at communities in the network. And so this is known as a meso or meso level structure where we can uncover subclusters of nodes in the network. So I'll very quickly go through some measures that we can get out of network science. So for the micro level measures, we are trying to quantify structure of the individual node in the system. And so the most basic one is the number of connections that a node has, which is known as degree. We can also look at the connectivity structure of the neighborhood of the node. We can compute something known as local clustering coefficient. And these other centrality measures are giving us information about the relative importance of nodes in a network based on different ideas. So closeness is giving us some information about accessibility of the node. Betweenness is giving us a sense of whether a node is a bottleneck in the system, where flows of information can become disrupted, right, if that bottleneck is affected. So for meso level, we are looking at the community structure of nodes in the network. Very quickly, we can give the big network to a community detection algorithm, which will uncover communities of nodes. And these are nodes that are more interconnected with each other than with nodes outside of the community. And we can measure how good this community partition is by using a measure called modularity. Finally, we can actually look at the whole network and we get some information about the structure of the entire network. Um, I will just maybe mention two. Okay, so first one is degree distribution, where we measure the all of the degrees of all of the nodes in the network, and then we try to see how the degrees are distributed, like in a probability distribution. And a common pattern that we find in real-world networks is a power law degree distribution. And that means that you have a few nodes that have all of the degrees, very high degree. These are hubs in the system. And most nodes have very few degree. And so we can characterize this degree distribution with a power law. The second measure that I will mention is this idea of small worldness. And this is something that we do find in our language and semantic networks. It has both the properties of being easy to navigate because it has a short path, average shortest path length. Um, and it also has a lot of local connectivity structure. And we can quantify how small world a network is using various metrics. Um, so in this talk, I will focus a bit more on my work on phonological networks, and I wanted to just put these two networks here for you to contrast them. Um, so the associative structure have they contain words, and this is actually from the Small World of Words project, which I think most people are very familiar with. And the edges come from human behavior. So from human responses to the word association task. If I give you the word language and you gave me the word grammar, then there's a connection between these two nodes. In contrast, for the form similarity type of network that is on the right, the connections here are researcher defined. So I have a theory or an idea about what are important neighbors of a given word, and that is implemented as edges in the form similarity network. Um, okay, and so I will focus on this on the right network, right, for this talk. Okay, so let's talk about how the structure of the lexicon affects processing. And this will be in every slide, I'm going to put the reference for the key reference that I'm referring to, so you can refer to later. And I also forgot to mention that you can download all of my slides from this link. Okay, so we're in the processing arm of the Venn diagram. Um, and what we have here on this slide actually is an image that I'm very proud of actually, because one, it took me a long time to make it nice and pretty. But I think it just showcases the complexity of the phonological and orthographic spaces that words reside in. So in the blue network on the left, we have the phonological neighborhood of the word cat. And the rule that we are using to connect the nodes is based on Lewis and Pizzoni's uh, one edit distance metric. So in this rule, if the two words are different by the substitution, addition, or deletion of one phoneme in any position of the word, we say that they are phonological neighbors and we draw a line between them, right? So we have a phonological neighborhood, and then we have a orthographic neighborhood where the connections are placed between words with one edit distance in terms of the letter, right, instead of the phoneme. Um, Now, if you look at the two networks, you can sort of see that there is a lot of overlap of the words in the phonological and orthographic neighborhood. And so we can try and combine them. And I've colored the overlapping uh, information in orange in the last network. And that really gives you a sense of this, how complex the space is, that there are parts that are overlapping and there are parts that are not overlapping. Okay. So I think we actually have a lot of historical research from many years of psycholinguistic research, which have shown that orthographic and phonological similarity have these important effects on lexical retrieval and on word recognition. Um, and so in the typical way that these similarity measures are treated are kind of as independent things to control for. And so that does make it a little bit hard to disentangle these effects sometimes. So the question that I asked in this work was whether we can have a new way or a new framework for trying to explore this interrelationship between orthography and phonology without treating them as separate things, but looking at them together in like a single system. Um, so what I did here was to leverage on an idea from network science and is known as a multiplex. Um, a multiplex is, there's a simple example on the left, but the idea is that you can have individual networks layered on top of each other. And so the same set of nodes or words are represented across all of the layers, but in each layer, the connections are different because they represent a different kind of similarity relationship. So in maybe the bottom layer, the edges are orthographic neighbors, and in the phonological layer, the edges are phonological neighbors. Okay, so that gives us a way to take the information from the phonological network and the orthographic neighborhood and extract what is overlapping. So we sort of go from this colorful image to the orange image where what's left are the words that are both phonological and orthographic neighbors of the target uh, word. Um, so what we did here was to extract some micro level network metrics that give us some information about individual words in the English network. So here is an example of one such metric is known as degree. And degree is the number of neighbors that a word has, right? The number of friends that a word has. In this case, this is phonographic neighbors, so both phonological and orthographic, right? And the word on the left has a lower degree than the word on the right. And this is similar to the idea of neighborhood size, right, in psycholinguistics. So the second measure that we looked at is C, which is clustering coefficient. And so what we have as an example here is that we have two words actually with the same number of degrees. So they have the same number of neighbors, but you can see that the connectivity structure within the neighborhood is different. So on the left, we can see that there's less connections among the neighbors, and so C is a lower value. And then on the right, C is much higher because you can see that the neighbors are also neighbors of each other, right? So I think a simple way of thinking about clustering coefficient is sort of like thinking if your friends that you know are also friends with each other. And if a lot of them are friends with each other, then you have a pretty high clustering coefficient. Okay. Um, okay, so the research question is to explore how degree and C affects word recognition in both spoken and visual modalities. And the important thing is to make sure that they are contributing more variance than just the independent contribution of phonological only or orthographic only network measures. So I'm not going to go through all the studies. We analyzed archival data, mega studies, we collected lexical decision experiments, various things. The big message is that phonographic similarity facilitates lexical retrieval in both spoken and visual word recognition. Mm. Okay, I already said that. And so words with more phonological neighbors are more quickly recognized, and words with more interconnectivity among its phonographic neighbors, so the high C words are also more quickly recognized. And so the general explanation that was offered in that paper is that when you have um, two layers of structural information and they are overlapping, uh, it's sort of like the structure is conspiring, working together to boost lexical retrieval, right? So we have a simple structural explanation for the facilitatory effects of the phonographic similarity. Um, the idea of conspiracy effects comes from, I think, older research where they looked at orthographic neighbors with inconsistent pronunciations, and they found that that led to uh, that inhibited processing. And so things working together, phonology and orthography working together, seems to help with lexical processing. Yeah, in a nutshell. Um, these survive the contribution of phonological only and orthographic only network measures, suggesting that you don't get the same effect by just adding the two. And I have replicated this in other mega studies that has emerged after my dissertation work. So it's nice to also see that, and also nice to see that we can replicate this in other languages as well. Unfortunately, not published, but I've done it, just wanted to mention. Okay, so I will try to speed up a lot more. I think I'm a bit slow. Okay, so let's sort of quickly summarize. Was trying to study this interrelationship of phonology and orthography, and we can leverage on network science to give us a representation that does that. And we can do very classic experiments. We can analyze megastudy data. And the conclusion is that phonographic degree and NC facilitates both visual and spoken word recognition. And this is true after even accounting for the individual influences of phonological and orthographic similarity. Okay, so in the next part, I want to talk a little bit about some work that looks at how the structure of the lexicon changes over time. And I want to say that this is something that I was not initially interested in doing in my research. I was interested in word recognition. I really thought of myself as a psycholinguist. But when you start to think about words in systems and in networks, that makes you think a little bit more about how the system came to be, or its trajectory, its developmental trajectory becomes a question that you naturally ask next. And so in this work, which is highlighted here, that's what we tried to do with the phonological language network. Um, this image actually is from the Dubrovsky et al. Paper, which the reference is below. And it is actually a representation of word association data over the lifespan. So we have a young associative network on the left, which is 10 years, then 18, and then all the way to the right, it's in its 70 years old stage. Um, and I really like this figure, and I'm going to copy what Thomas Hills would describe this image when he would give his talks, is that the lexicon looks like it's breathing in and then it's breathing out. You can kind of see this trend in the beginning where it's taking in all of the notes, taking all of the connections, and then at the end of life, it's exhaling, right? And you see some of the weaker associations being lost and gaps emerging in the network. And so this very beautiful imagery that I have, and it makes you want to study changes in this system. And luckily, we do have a way of formalizing and asking some of these questions. And something that's nice about the network science framework is that it gives you this tractable way of testing, like accounts of development of the lexicon. Okay, so this part here, I'm happy to take questions if something is not clearly explained, because I'm just going to go through it in a very high level abstract way. But essentially, we have two types of networks being modeled here. Um, we have a learner, okay, what is known as a known word network. So this is the set of words that the learner knows. And then we have the language environment, which is both the known and the unknown words. And then I think the question that we are trying to address in this work is given given the words that a learner knows, which is the next word that is most likely to be acquired, right? And updating that representation and then making the next prediction and moving to the end. Um, so what the networks what the two images here are representing are two different ideas about network growth. One of them is on the left, preferential attachment. And this is a growth model from network science, which says that rich nodes get richer. So if a node has many connections, like this node A here, it's more likely to gain new connections. And so the prediction of the model here is to learn N1 next, because that makes A richer. Um, and so the key idea here is that it's a formalization of how structure in the internal lexicon is driving acquisition. Okay. So on the flip side, we have preferential acquisition. And in here, the node that is more likely to be learned next is not N1, but N3, because this is the node that is the richest node in the language environment. And the way that Hills et al. Describe this process is that nodes that are rich in the environment are basically concepts that are very salient, right? And you can imagine that these such concepts have a preferential advantage, right, for being acquired. So preferential acquisition makes a different prediction, and the prediction is based on the structure of the whole language network, which includes both the known and unknown words. Okay, so um, before doing this work with phonological networks, people have already looked at semantic network growth and development using these two models, and they found evidence for preferential acquisition, which means that it's the structure in the environment that drives learning. So the question is that if the edges here are now phonological, is it going to be preferential attachment or preferential acquisition? Okay, so the data that we use here is age of acquisition norms for English and Dutch words. So that gives us the nodes or the words and in an ordered vector, right? And we can use this to slice up the phonological networks. Um, we built the models to have each model give a prediction about which words are likely to be learned in the next time step, then update the the model, and then make a new prediction, and so on and so forth. Um, very I think I'll just quickly run through this part here. So the the two different networks give a different prediction uh, about which unknown word is likely to be learned next. We can also include some lexical covariates into our regression and see how good that model prediction fits what we actually observe. Okay, so the results. Um, so first of all, is we can just rule out preferential acquisition, which is the semantic network growth result. That was not a significant predictor in this analysis, but we found evidence for preferential attachment. Um, Now, the nature of this pattern is quite complex. So it is sort of like a normal preferential attachment at the beginning of the lexicon. So when a lexicon is young, you can see that there's a positive effect of preferential attachment in the blue and the green. Sorry, the blue and the red lines. Um, but when the lexicon is older, then we have an inverse preferential attachment um, pattern that emerged. And so the green line is negatively sloped. Um, and so I guess the findings suggest that when the lexicon is young, the rich gets richer effect is happening, where nodes with many phonological neighbors are gaining more phonological neighbors, and that's really like bootstrapping the process of acquiring the words. But once it gets filled out and the lexicon is a little bit more full, um, the the uh, the preference now is for distinctive phonological word forms. So uh, instead of the rich getting richer, it's the less rich that are getting richer now. Okay, so um, big take-home message here is that for phonological representations, it seems that structure in the lexicon is driving acquisition. But when we are looking at a semantic network, it's the structure in the environment that is driving acquisition. Um, in that same paper, we did some word learning experiments that basically confirm the inverse preferential attachment effect for mature lexicons. Nice thing about word recognition, word learning is that you can craft the non-words to take on certain properties based on the phonological network, and so we can have a low preferential attachment non-word and a high preferential attachment non-word, and compare the word learning performance of these two words. And then we found that it's the lower non-words with the lower preferential attachment values that are more accurately learned. Um, Another neat thing about networks is that you can do fun simulations of growing artificial networks by various kinds of network growth models and algorithms. And in this work, um, the networks that are grown by the inverse preferential attachment first, then the inverse version, had network properties that more closely resemble what we actually see in real world phonological language networks. So that's kind of also nice to have a different way of looking at this question. Um, okay, so to summarize, we are trying to uh, look at how the phonological network grows over time, and we are leveraging on some network growth models to give us a way of testing or assessing these ideas. Um, can leverage on longitudinal network analysis of HR acquisition norms. Um, Actually, a diversity of approaches were used in this to answer this question. Um, and we find that for phonological development, early acquisition is driven by this rich gets richer um, idea, and then later acquisition tends to prefer phonologically distinctive words. Okay, and so oh, I wanted to just very quickly also point out that the key finding has also been replicated by these two other researchers. So it's also very nice to see independent replications of the work. Okay, so in this last part, this is my more recent work where I'm trying to bring the two a little bit closer together, where I want to think about processing, but I also want to think about how the development of the lexicon affects the processing. Um, and these are the two uh, papers that I'm going to refer to in this part of the talk. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the features of the phonological network. Um, so as I mentioned previously, a lot of the semantic and the phonological networks that we have analyzed so far have this classic small world structure. And one of the features of the small world is a short average shortest path length. So in the phonological network of English words, the average shortest path length is 6. What that implies is that if I pick any two words in the network, um, I can connect them on average with 6 steps. So it's a really important feature because it suggests efficiency of navigation, efficiency of retrieval um, of concepts, right, in the lexicon. Some words are connected by short paths, and then some words are connected by long paths, right? Because what we have here, 6.05 is an average score. Another another feature that we see in phonological networks of various languages is community structure. And so recall that this is the meso level structure that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, where the communities are groups of words that share um, similar phonological segments or chunks, right? Um, and this has been found in not just English, but in Dutch, in French, and other Indo-European languages that we analyzed in this paper with Justin. Um, so I guess the big question of these two papers is to try to see if people are sensitive to this higher level um, network structure of the phonological network. So um, as a contrast, right, the typical way is to look at individual words and get their degree and get some metrics and correlate that with behavioral um, um, results. But I wanted to see if we can find some behavioral signatures of community structure, right? Or of distances between pairs of nodes in a network. So um, this does imply that we need to select the pairs of words rather than individual words in the experiments that I'll describe later. So with L2 speakers, another additional question we can ask is that whether this sensitivity to the global and meso level structure of the lexicon is that modulated by their proficiency level. Um, so we are going to look at sound similarity judgments of pairs of words, and we have some initial hypotheses. We think that if the word pairs are separated by a longer path in the phonological network, people should think that that's less similar sounding, right, than word pairs that are separated by a short path. If the word pairs come from the same community in the phonological network, we think that the individuals should perceive these word pairs to be more similar sounding than word pairs that come from different communities. And with the L2 participants, we think that if they are scoring better on a measure like Lextail, um, that they show greater sensitivity to these structural features of the phonological network. So we need to select pairs of words from the network, and we make sure that the pairs of words were either from the same or different community. That's the first variable. And then the second variable is the distance of the word pair, right? So the if a word pair is separated by one, actually just means that they are direct neighbors of each other. And then if it's two, it means that you need two steps, right, to get from word one to word two. So there's a little toy network here where the green and the yellow represent different communities in this toy network. And you can see that the green and the yellow are kind of two separate clumps or clusters in the network. And I, mm, I think my cursor is visible. But we can select pairs of words, right? Like this node here and this node here, where my cursor is, such that they are in different communities, like this one. And we can select this one here and this one here. They are both in the same yellow community, but both of them have the same path length of two, right? So we are crossing these two variables, these two IVs here, to uh, for our design. Yeah. So based on that criteria that I mentioned, we created a stimuli set like of 200 English word pairs or two sets of them. Sorry. We counterbalance the order of the word pairs among the participants, and some examples of those word pairs are shown here. And the task for the participants is quite straightforward. They would listen to the word pairs one after the other, and then they have to decide if they sound similar or not by pressing a button. So this is a binary decision. They just say, yes, it sounds similar, or no, it does not sound similar. Um, they there are other better ways of doing this with maybe you have a continuous measure, you can have a Likert scale. But when we were doing these experiments, I think we decided to make things as simple as possible as an initial first step, right? So it's a binary decision, and we have two groups of participants. One is the native English speakers, the L1, and then the second group are participants with English L2. And importantly, they have a range of L1s. We did not try to control for that. It's a very open kind of recruitment, um, but it was very diverse. Um, and we measured their, hmm, yes, and for the L2 participants, we measured their Lextail. So they completed the Lextail, which is a very popular, commonly used tests of vocabulary knowledge in English. It is essentially a visual lexical decision task. Um, and given strings of letters, decide if they heard a word, not a word. And the graph here just is a depiction of the fact that we have a range of participants across the across the Lextel score. So we had some that scored really highly and some that did not score as highly. It's a good range of L2 proficiencies. Okay, I'll just quickly go through the descriptive results. This is from the L1, just pure descriptive results where you can see that as the path length between the word pairs increases, the number of similar judgment goes down, as you expect. And then for community, if the word pairs are in the same community, we actually got more, uh, a larger proportion of similar sounding responses. Yeah. Um, we have a similar pattern with the L2 results. I just depicted in proportions slightly differently, but we still see that same community word pairs have more similar responses, and as path length increases, the proportion of similar responses also drops. Right. So the two groups show very similar patterns. Um, for the L2, we want to further see if their Lextel score might kind of moderate the effect sizes of the community and of the distance effects. And so this is the model that we ran in just to sort of also emphasize that we included a lot of lexical covariates to see if the network effects would survive the inclusion of these covariates, and they all did. And so the basically the similarity judgments that we are seeing here are not cannot be accounted for by things like how acoustically similar the two words sound like, or the audio files of the two words were like. Um, so very quickly, let's look at the interaction effects, which were all significant and were sort of in the direction that we expected. So that's really nice to see. So if we look at this community Lextel interaction effect, the thing to focus on is on the distance between the dotted and the solid lines. And this distance is smaller when Lextel score is lower. And as proficiency increases, you can see that the gap between solid and dotted increases, right? And so what it implies is that participants who have scored higher on Lextel, who have bigger L2 vocabularies or proficiency, they show a greater effect of community. Uh, yes, of community in their similarity judgments. Okay. So this is the distance and Lextel effect, interaction effect. And again, we want to focus on the gaps, right, between the lines. And so you can see that the gap between solid, dotted, and the less different dotted is smaller when Lextel is lower, and when Lextel is higher, the gap increases. So again, it's sort of showing that the um, the participants with that scored higher on Lextel are showing a greater sensitivity to distance effects. Okay. So we find that the L1 and L2 participants, they are sensitive to large-scale structure of the phonological language network. This is actually a nice replication of the previous work done with semantic distances. So they also had a similar paradigm where they had pairs of words that were different in the semantic distances in the semantic network, also found a very similar thing. Um, so we found that with our phonological, I guess with our phonological version of that task. A new thing that we included is the sensitivity to community structure. It's a very subtle effect, but it still survived all of the other covariates and is statistically robust. And with our L2 participants, we found that the ones that scored higher on the Lextel task showed stronger effects of path length and community structure. So we can, okay, so I think we can stop here, right, and say that this is a very nice pattern of findings, but at this point, I wanted to try and push um, push for a deeper understanding of these effects, I guess. We have a network measure or a network structure and then we see some behavioral pattern, but we want to try and understand what is that linkage, that mechanistic linkage between the two, right? So in these studies, we explored um, whether we can use a simple process of spreading activation to provide one account of these findings. So at this point, I need to introduce Spreader, which is a R package that I wrote a long time ago that implements spreading activation in a network. Um, I will quickly say that the R package has been removed from CRAN R because I forgot to update some dependency, but you can still download the package on GitHub. Okay, I can answer questions about that too. So spreading activation is actually a really core concept in cognitive psychology from the time of Collins and Loftus. And the idea here is that it's providing an explanation for some of the semantic priming effects, semantic judgment effects that we saw in that literature from that time, right, in the 70s and the 80s. So what we are doing here is basically a formalization of that idea. Um, I think Collins and Loftus sort of discussed it in more a bit more vague terms, a bit more of like a quali qualitative explanation, but here we want to model it pretty formally in a network. So what we have here is a network structure that you can uh, present, or you can implement in iGraph, which is a R package for network analysis. And then you can put activation values on the nodes and let that spread in depending on its connectivity structure. So um, you have to assume that activation is some kind of limited resource and that they can move around the network space, and that movement is just determined by the links or the edges in the network. So if we just look at this very small video, um, you can see that it starts off like with no activation, and then I put activation values on two nodes, which is similar to the word pair sort of studies that I described just now. And then we let it spread based on how things are connected in the network. So activation from node one uh, cannot directly go to node 7. It has to sort of go through node 2 first, and then it spreads on to node 7. So that's the idea. Okay, I'll try and speed up. Um, so we did a simulation study where we tried to activate two nodes that represent the word pair, and then we let it spread for a while. And then we need some way of quantifying the final activation state, right, of the network. So we use entropy to quantify that. If it's high entropy, it means that the activations are more random-like. If it's low entropy, it means that you're getting converging activations in the network. And so what we wanted to see if these entropy measures are correlated with the behavioral results that we have. And so this is from the first study or the first paper where we are trying to predict the behavioral outcome, proportion of similar responses from our entropy measure. And we find that the entropy measure is always, the coefficients are always significant and they're negative, meaning that lower entropy is associated with higher probability of similar responses. So there are converging patterns that is associated with more similar sounding. Okay. Um, I guess the the, the table also includes um, some network measures, right? The path length, the community, and the fact that we find that entropy is still a significant predictor suggests that it's not enough to just have the network structure. It's the network structure and the spreading activation that provides the better account of the behavior. We repeated this for the second study, but the cool thing is that we did it with networks of different sizes. So we had a network for lower proficiency, middle proficiency, higher proficiency, inferred from learner corpora of English. And we are able to recover that behavioral finding that the larger network sizes giving entropy patterns that show greater sensitivity to distance and community. That's really, really cool. So the larger network is combined with a simple process of spreading activation gives you, I think, more, s- uh, just gives you more ability to represent fine-grained nuance similarity structure, right? At the meso level, at the global level. And this is a speculation, but the communities may serve as an important, or I think may serve as an important organizational feature as the network is growing and becoming like very big. And there are some older ideas about phonological templates, right, where learners sort of use these phonological templates to like bootstrap their learning of new forms. The community sort of structure in networks could be like a formalization of that idea. And so I don't think I've answered a lot of questions. There are still, I think it has more questions that need to be answered, like from this work, but it's just a very first initial step into this world. Okay. I think in the interest of time, I'll just stop here. But I think I want to say thank you to everyone for listening uh, to my talk. And I want to acknowledge these individuals, Mike Vitovich, Thomas Hills, Nicole Castro, and Justin Chen. These are people who work very closely with me on these sets of studies that I presented today. I'm so sorry I went over time, but I will take questions. Yes, thank you. Do I stop sharing my screen or? Okay,
Oh, that's fine. That's
okay.
fine. You can leave it there. Thank you, Cynthia, for that wonderful presentation and very interesting talk. So we now have time for questions. Let me explain the procedure again. You can let me know if you have a question in the chat, or you can raise your hand like with the Zoom function directly and ask your question. You can ask your question by either posting your question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, ask your question in English. You can pop on camera and also sign your question in international sign. So right now we are open for your questions whenever you're ready.
I see a raised hand. I also just saw a uh, in the chat.
Right.
So
Hope.
maybe Hope can go first because I think the hand was up first.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll be speaking in English. First of all, thank you so much. What a fascinating talk. That is great. Oh, I have a message on my machine. Or my okay. Yeah, that was lovely. Wow. I have actually so many questions, and some of them are a bit complicated, and I have to remind myself what they are. But let me just ask one right off is about, so you're in a community of people here now who are doing a lot of sign language research, and so one thing, a more equal comparison with spoken languages would be using oral responses and not written responses. I guess I'm thinking of the word association kind of work. Um, and if that would give you a uh, different information than working through text.
Yes. So the way that the networks are constructed will definitely uh, change what the networks represent and their structure. So um, in my world, yeah, it's very convenient for us to use phonological transcriptions and then just make them into networks. But the thing that we have observed is that when we ask people to give word associations that sound similar to the cue words, they do tend to give the same sets of words. So there is, at least in spoken English, which is the language that most of this work has been conducted in, see an alignment of what is from the transcriptions and what people say sounds similar. In sign, yeah, it's a very interesting question. Is what it would be, what would you consider to be neighbors is sort of the question that I would ask, because in I think I mentioned in the earlier part of the talk about when I was looking at the associative and the form similarity network, is that there are different ways to construct networks. Is it coming from the community? Is it coming from some theoretical idea about what edges are important to model? And not to say that they are, I think these two approaches would need to work together in sign, actually. So I think maybe that would be something that I will say for now, and then uh we'll have a discussion later, right? So you can ask more questions. Okay.
Maybe I just will add the appendage that was not very obvious is that we don't work in a spoken or a written form
Not
because
written.
sign
Okay.
languages don't have an orthography. I think we all know that, but just to be perfectly clear.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll give it to someone else and ask another question later.
Uh, in the chat.
Thank you very much, Hope.
Oh.
I see a question from Kirill in the chat.
It's actually a question from Saul. Could the interpreters please read it out loud so we
Yeah.
can tell?
A question from Saul, yes.
A question from Saul coming in. Thank you. Great talk. I like to ask about something I might have missed. Sorry in advance if I got lost. My question is about having more than one route to connect two words and the number of steps in these alternate routes. For example, in slide 36, you showed a network with words separated by two steps, red edges, the shortest route. The network also shows other longer routes connecting both words. Do you think the presence of these longer routes and the number of these alternate routes might also influence the results? Perhaps this is already accounted for in the community structure measures. I'm talking about whole routes between two words, not the number of edges of a word.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in these studies, we just took the shortest possible path between the word pairs. So it is true that in a very complex network, if you pick any two nodes in a network, they'll be connected by a short path, right? But they will also be connected by other longer paths, and so there are alternative routes, right, to get from A to B. As I would say that that's not something that I've looked at in this set of studies, but I imagine that that would play some role, right? If people are sensitive to that higher level structure, then you could potentially be like, okay, for these two nodes or in the network, what's the short path, but also what's the distribution of the paths that you could take? And then you can measure if that distribution is, I guess, more flat, or is it more random? And it's very subtle, but I just what I would say is that I think it's like mathematically possible to model these things. Uh, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for that response, Cynthia. Thank you, Saul, for the question. I've seen two people raising their hands, Yoed
Okay.
and also Lisa. So I'll give the floor to Yoed first.
Hello. Can you hear
Hi,
me?
Yoed.
Hello. So first, Cynthia, I'm a huge fan, and I again think the work that you're doing is groundbreaking. But you know this already, right? I was hoping maybe you can talk a little bit about things that I am thinking a lot about, and I think could be relevant here as well, which is how can we move from using networks from explanation to intervention. How can you use the amazing insights you've gained at the phonological level and orthographic to start maybe using this in interventions, implementations, like for learning and maybe helping learning in different languages for different populations, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question and a very big question. Hmm. Okay, so two things come to mind. One is I actually have a paper with Nicole where we did the same task but with people with aphasia, so word finding difficulties. And we actually found that among that population, there are different signatures of how they do the phonological distance tasks. So one group shows the similar drop off, I guess, that we see with uh, the typical population. And then we find another group with very atypical phonological similarity ratings, and that can point right um, to maybe different kinds of phonological therapy that that population might need depending on how they do the task. And then, but I guess in terms of, like intervention, the thing that I can think of is like Duolingo and language learning, right? Like it can we sort of use structural features in the phonological network as are there landmarks that we can bootstrap the learning of phonological forms on, right? Um, but I will admit that I have not done anything in this area, so this is all speculation. But like it's really um something that I agree with, right? That we want to move the field forward in ways that can have some practical sort of contributions as well, not just doing the theory and doing the modeling and like can it be something that is actually useful. But in terms of foreign language learning, that's my thought is that the communities seem to be signposting important templates for that language. And so it's just a matter of can we leverage that information. But yeah, thank you for the question, Yoet. It's good to see
Thank
you too.
you. Yeah.
Next question, I guess, too.
Hi. I will speak.
Yeah, the last question would be Lisa.
Oh.
So, Lisa, you
Yeah,
have the
do
floor.
you hear me? Do you hear me? Okay, good. I will sign and speak at the same time. So maybe translating to international would be good for complete understanding. Yeah. Oh, thank you. I really love your work, and it's so interesting to see this, especially because my current research is about sign language linguistics, and also the mental, lexicon and how signs are built up. And as Hope already mentioned, my question is kind of related to that, and I want to brainstorm about it. As I understand it correctly, your research is more focusing on spoken language and the written language that are related to each other. That path is kind of frequent, sequential, it has a kind of order like cat is CAT, but a sign has multiple elements that are functional at a similar time. How would you visualize kind of your work into a kind of all the parameters and similarity of signs? Do you have any idea about that?
That's a great question, and thank you so much for that. That's a really difficult question. I For science, is there a vector of features you could work with? I like from
Well, if
a
you only
no.
watch the phonological part of
Mm-hmm.
sign language, and then we speak only about the manual part, so not the non-manual part, then so that's basically those are aligned, but then we drop that part and only look at the hands. Then you have 5 kind of parameters, elements that combined are forming one sign. So that's my question, like cat is really ordered. That's kind of easy to map into from phonological part to written part. But as Hope already mentioned, sign languages do originally not have a written form. So how would you make those 5 elements into one form? That's my question, and then make it describable like you did into lexicons and structures. Easy question, huh?
Yeah, gosh, I don't think I have an answer to that question. Or what I will just very briefly mention is that when we are making networks of whatever language that we are trying to study, is that we need to do it with consultation with people who are in that community and are experts on that. So, for example, a very long time ago, Mike Vitovich had a paper with other people where they analyzed the phonological networks of different languages, and one of them was Mandarin Chinese. They didn't include any tone information in the network representation, which to me is not great because, in that language, tones are important lexical features that need to be represented in the network. But then it's also a difficult question because tones are not easily represented either. So but there's just a small example of when I read that work and it's like, you cannot have Chinese networks without this very important feature. And so I think I need to really understand what is going on with sign. I really at a really deep level, and then I can try and see if there are interesting features of ways of modeling that information. But right now, I can't say I have a solution. So
Yeah, no, I understand, and it's
yeah.
kind of not really fair to ask this to you. But I asked this because your work is so important and can be so important also for sign language linguistics, and that's why I was just curious about your opinion. Like, how can we make your work transformable to sign languages? Because that's one point I think that is missing into science and sign language research at this moment. Uh, so that's why. But thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's a question in the chat which I will leave for it to be asked.
Okay, I see a question from Matt Brown. Can we get it, read it out loud, please, by the interpreter?
Right. Question from Matt Brown. Really great talk. Thank you. Quick question if there is time. How are we defining mental lexicon? Can it include polymorphemic structures or compounds? What about longer constructions that aren't traditionally seen as compounds but do occur relatively frequently? Do they live in the lexicon?
Thank you for all these great questions. Yes, I didn't define what is in the lexicon. And I have been a bit lazy about that because we are just using a list of words that we have phonological transcriptions with. But in theory, the lexicon is a mental store of not just words, but could be compounds, could be lexicalized units, right, that are used in a person's everyday communication. If a compound is used frequently enough, and you could make the argument that it is part of the lexicon and it thus should be modeled as being in the lexicon. So I guess I hope that answers your question because yes, I mean, and yeah, I think that I would just stop at that point. I would say that some of these structures could be in the lexicon. I just haven't included them in mine.
Thank you for that answer, Cynthia. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and your interest. I'm really sorry, but we're running over time. So I need to close today's session, but I really want to thank Cynthia for her contribution and everyone for participating in this session. So thank you very much and see you next time.